This I'll just mention quickly. Don't have a lot to say about this, but G7 countries, including United States, reach agreement to shut down all coal-fired power plants by 2035. What a terrible idea. Now, a lot of what I've said now, what I'm going to say now, I've said before, and I'm very open to being corrected, obviously. But here is the Uzalu power generation spiel. Ready? Most of the West's power is generated by fossil fuels. And though it is heavily polluting, and whether you buy all of the narrative about climate change or none of it or some of it, it's polluting. It's unpleasant stuff. You're breathing right now the unpleasant chemical byproducts of burning fossil fuels. Every day you're breathing the byproducts. That's not in dispute. It's nasty stuff. But it's not fatal. It's still not quite as bad as China's smog problem. And it's more efficient than it used to be, cleaner than it used to be. And it's necessary to maintain our industry. Unless you do what a few countries have done, notably France, and you use nuclear power, which is much better, much cleaner. Bear in mind, the nuclear waste from nuclear power generation is a relatively small amount, relatively easy to contain, and it can be done very, very securely these days, to the extent that you can lick the container and be perfectly safe. Although I wouldn't lick the container, it's been outside, that's nasty. But yeah, you can be perfectly safe. And unlike coal, it does not put dangerous chemicals in the air. Those big towers, that's steam. It's just cooling towers. So nuclear fission, very good. We don't need fusion. Fission's already good enough. Obviously, we'll have fusion once it's ready, but we don't need it right now. Fusion's good enough. That's fine. We don't need to worry about that. Renewable stuff like wind and solar, then I think for wind it's probably not a good idea to continue to pursue it. I don't think it's worth it. From what I've seen, with solar, I think there are sometimes it might be a good idea to have solar, but for the amount of space it uses, it's not really worth it. For the amount of space it uses, you should, and if you have the funding to do so, build a nuclear power plant there instead. It costs a lot more, but it generates so much more power. It's like 1,000 times more efficient for the space than solar. And they don't take as long to build as has been reported. They're not necessarily more expensive. They're maybe only a little bit more expensive than coal plants, and they only take maybe a couple more years to build. It's not the decade-long, multi-billion-dollar project that has been often claimed. And as long as China's not involved, then I'm happy. So that's those. Tidal power is actually sort of growing in popularity, and it seems like that may have some viability, but it's still a bit far behind. The hydroelectricity is, that one's pretty good. It can have some ecological impacts, but if you do it properly, that's negligible. But it does require specific landscape features, so it's very limited. In my sort of amateur knowledge, a nation should probably put any hydroelectric plant they can in place. If you have a fast-flowing river, if you have waterfalls, whatever landscape feature you need, you should put a hydroelectric plant there. Obviously, you can't do too many, and there's a limit, but you should meet your limit and then stop. I think one of the Scandinavian countries, it might be Norway or Sweden, possibly Denmark, are self-sufficient energy-wise, and it's mostly kind of hydroelectricity. So there's that, but a lot of countries can't really do hydroelectric at all. And then the last one is geothermal, which is probably, as far as I've been reading recently, an underestimated form of energy generation. I think possibly there's going to be, in the near future, more investment into the potential of drilling down far enough that you can take advantage of the natural heat of the planet itself, just to boil water. You could drill a line, put some water down there, boil it, and the steam just comes out. Don't know if that's exactly how it would work, but you need to be able to drill very deep and it not collapse, which is difficult. But there's a lot of potential there that hasn't been met. I believe it was, I heard recently that like the outer 10% of the Earth's mantle, the heat of the outer 10% of the Earth's mantle, would meet our current complete civilizational power needs for how long do you reckon? 1 year? 10 years? 50 years? 100 million years? Quite a lot of power down there, if we can get to it. So there are a lot of alternatives to fossil fuels that make sense. Mostly nuclear, but more investment into tidal, geothermal, and the implementation of hydroelectric is also a good idea. Moving on from actual sources, right? The idea of fossil fuels itself, as I said, most of civilization's power, especially China, power generation is done by fossil fuels. Now, you'll notice G7 countries, China's not agreed to this. China's laughing at this. Of course they are. Should we be so concerned about, let's assume that the climate change narrative is entirely true, should we be so concerned about that we start shutting down, we start essentially deindustrializing? Obviously not. That is entirely suicidal. We've got to make a choice. Do we, one, want worthwhile civilizations among humanity to just disappear? Or do we, two, want to push forward to the point that we can replace fossil fuels and begin to reverse the damage done by global warming, by climate change? Again, assuming the narrative is entirely true. Because at this point, we can't go backwards. We can try to become more efficient. We can try to, even if we try and slow down our civilizational progress, our industrial progress, to try to reduce climate change, by some quote-unquote expert opinions, it's way too late to even do that. And if it is too late, why the hell are we slowing down? We should power forward industrially to the point that we can reverse the damage efficiently. And also, of course, replace fossil fuels with nuclear. And if we're not at the point of no return yet, then we have time. In terms of resource availability, many of you may have heard that we are running out of oil. We're not. There's a couple of hundred years at least, maybe 500 years worth of oil in known reservoirs alone. I think there's at least a few hundred years in the US alone that aren't being used. Now, you may think, well, we should be careful to retain that as long as possible. In 500 years, do you think we're still going to be using oil to power everything? I'm not saying it's useless, and obviously oil is good for other things as well. But I think in 500 years we can find something else. I think in 500 years we probably crack fusion. It's always 10 years away, yeah, but is it 500 years away? Probably not. I think we can crack fusion in the next couple hundred years at least, and probably some other things too. So no, I think drill at this point. Drill to supply the existing fossil fuel power plants, but all new power plants should be nuclear, or of course one of the other ones I mentioned. And yes, keep research and development into renewables, because you can put them in places you can't put other power plants. You can harvest energy that's otherwise wasted, and you can it's non-polluting. It doesn't even require the nuclear waste. And the small risk of the nuclear development, the nuclear enrichment being used for weapons or anything like that. Very small risk, but possible. Tidal and solar primarily, I think, are the things to aim for. There's developments in solar perovskite crystals, for example, which will make it a lot better in the near future. And by the way, fun fact: photosynthesis is 3% efficient. You know how efficient solar power is? About 50%. So you may be thinking nature's so great we can't ever overcome it. In some ways, true. In that way, we are already about, what was that, like 20, little under 20, about 15 times better than nature. Kieran says, we will be needing oil for longer than just power. Plastics are integral to, yes, I agree. But one, I believe there are other ways to make plastics. And two, burning oil does not use up the bit that we can make plastic out of. So I don't think that'll be a problem. Mining it now is no different really than mining it in a couple hundred years. We can still use it for plastics either way. It may be, though, that if Earth completely runs out of oil one day, and once all the plastic has been shredded and is no longer useful, then we may have to find something alternative. But that's probably hundreds of years away at least. By that time, who knows what we will have figured out as an alternative. It's a lot of time. as Pax says, it's not likely the Earth will run out of oil. Yeah, probably not. So Zorg says, my dad was telling me about a bunch of investors setting up to build a big nuclear plant in Wyoming, but locals voted to block it as much as Wyoming generally votes our way. They are still NIMBYists here. There's a lot of bad rep around nuclear and a lot of hippie activists, but I think that might be a bit of a smokescreen. I think probably the main reason it's happening, and I don't know, I don't have any evidence for this, but the motives line up. I suspect that somewhere up that chain, China is laughing that they are preventing the US from building nuclear. Of course, the most efficient for pure industrialization and power generation method is fossil fuels, which is, funnily enough, in alignment with the fact that China keeps doing it, but the West keeps swearing off it. In terms of pure money for power, it's fossil fuels. But in terms of money for power whilst considering pollution, it's obviously nuclear. Actually, even for money for power, nuclear might technically be better, but it's a little harder, a little less reliable. So, sure. But China would love the West to do neither of those things. China would love the West to have rolling brownouts while our windmills spin around off the coast somewhere, killing birds occasionally and setting on fire and not being recyclable and being made of resources, materials that China sells, etc., etc. And solar similarly. As I said, solar's, I think, more viable than wind, but still. So nuclear is the way to go. And it is growing in popularity. I think, I haven't seen actual data on this, but I expect if you looked into data on this, you would see that younger people are beginning to approve of nuclear more. I've seen a map of levels of approval of nuclear power in Europe, and it's quite mixed. UK is pro, France is pro, Germany is anti, and there's quite a few other countries. It's not clear what the correlation is, actually, of which countries support it and which don't, but we will see, I suppose, in the next few decades which one proves the better, and it will be nuclear. They says, I give a shit about anything green when China and India do first. I still won't then, but you gotta think that even if it didn't start that way, even if there are other benefits to it, and even if the climate change narrative is entirely true, China is very happy that the West is so obsessed with the green stuff. It's very beneficial to them, and they don't care at all. It might get to the point where like 90% of the world's quote unquote climate change contributions are from China, and the West, at least in our current state, would still be scrambling to remove our last 10%, while China is just absolutely filling the air with fossil fuel residue and not even trying to make it more clean and efficient, because you can make it a bit more clean and efficient. The West has done that, but China's not bothering. Spray painting their fields green all the time. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, Achilles. Yeah. As Pax says, mining is always cheaper than synthesizing. I expect that's probably always true, yeah. Because it already exists. For example, if you want to... Like, we can synthesize elements in the lab, but why the hell would we? When we can synthesize atom by atom, yeah, but there's like trillions of atoms worth of stuff buried underground, and we know how to do mining, so why wouldn't you? So that's that. This is bad. And 2035 is so soon as well. This would be suicide if it was actually done, which is why I hope it isn't. If Trump gets in, which of course he will if the election is not successfully rigged, then hopefully he just says no to this shit, as he mostly did before with the climate Paris Accords, whatever. Any sensible country should say no to this, unless they are specifically replacing them with a equal, power generation amount of nuclear and the other sources I listed that are actually good.